The early morning sun peeked over the Denver skyline, casting a golden glow on the bustling airport. Passengers hurried to their gates, pulling suitcases and clutching coffee cups. Among them was Rick Thompson, a retired Air Force pilot in his mid-60s, who walked with the steady gait of a man who'd seen a lifetime of adventure. Rick wasn't thrilled about commercial air travel. It felt cramped, slow, and uninspiring compared to the fighter jets he used to fly. But today he was on Pacific Sky Airlines Flight 712 to New York City to visit his daughter, Allison, and her newborn baby. As Rick settled into his seat near the back of the plane, he noticed the pilot stepping aboard. Captain Erin Malone, a tall woman with sharp features, greeted passengers with a polite smile, though Rick detected the slight weariness in her eyes. Years of flying had taught him how to spot fatigue in a fellow pilot. "Long night," Rick muttered under his breath, watching her head to the cockpit. Next to him, a nervous young man fidgeted with his seatbelt. "You ever flown before?" he asked Rick. Rick smirked. "Once or twice." A few rows up, Samantha Sam Ellis, a young flight attendant on one of her first long-haul routes, walked the aisle with a clipboard. Her smile was bright but tinged with nervous energy as she double-checked that everyone was settled. By the time the plane took off and climbed smoothly into the clear blue sky, Rick was already dozing lightly, lulled by the hum of the engines. He didn't notice when Captain Malone began to feel faint. The plane had reached cruising altitude when it happened. Captain Malone's vision blurred, and her head felt impossibly heavy. "I need a minute," she said weakly to First Officer Jordan, who looked at her in alarm. Before he could respond, she slumped forward, unconscious. "Captain?" Jordan's voice wavered. He tried to rouse her, but panic quickly overtook him. The controls suddenly felt alien under his trembling hands. The plane jolted slightly as it began to descend. In the cabin, passengers looked up from their books and movies, alarmed. A moment later, the intercom crackled as Samantha's voice came through, tight with anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant speaking. We're experiencing a minor issue with the cockpit. If anyone on board has piloting experience, please press your call button." Rick's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he stayed frozen in his seat, his mind racing. He hadn't flown in over a decade. Could he even handle a modern commercial aircraft? But when the plane gave another unsettling lurch, his instincts took over. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "I've got some experience," he said, his voice steady but firm. Samantha practically ran to meet him. "Are you serious?" she asked, wide-eyed. "Retired Air Force," Rick said simply. When Rick entered the cockpit, the sight was chaos. Captain Malone was slumped over in her seat, and First Officer Jordan was pale and shaking, barely able to keep his hands on the controls. Alarms blared, and the plane continued to descend. "Step aside, son," Rick said, his voice commanding. Jordan looked at him, unsure, but obeyed. Rick slipped into the pilot's seat, scanning the controls. "All right, let's stabilize this bird," he muttered. His hands found the yoke, and he gently pulled back, leveling the plane. The alarms quieted as the descent stopped, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. "Good work," Samantha said from behind him. "Don't thank me yet," Rick replied. He pointed at Captain Malone. "What happened to her?" "We think it's some kind of medical emergency," Samantha said. "She needs a hospital, fast." "Great," Rick muttered, his eyes scanning the instrument panel. "But first, we need to figure out where we're going. Get me air traffic control." Samantha handed Rick the radio headset, but static hissed in his ear. "Radio's out," she said nervously. "Of course it is," Rick sighed. He turned to Jordan, who was still frozen. "Kid, I need you to pull yourself together. What's the nearest airport we can reach?" Jordan stammered out the name of a small regional airstrip about 300 miles away. Rick's hands moved instinctively, adjusting the controls to redirect the plane. "All right, we'll aim for that. But first, let's deal with this radio. Sam, see if you can find a manual around here." Samantha scoured the cockpit and pulled out a hefty binder. Together, she and Rick worked through the troubleshooting steps, and after several tense minutes, they managed to restore a faint connection. Pacific Sky 712, this is Denver Air Traffic Control. We've been trying to reach you, came the crackling voice. Denver, this is Rick Thompson, retired Air Force. I'm currently in command of Flight 7112. We've got a medical emergency with the pilot and need to make an emergency landing. As Rick continued communicating with air traffic control, a new warning light blinked on the dashboard. He frowned. Fuel's leaking, he said grimly. Jordan finally found his voice. We'll never make it to the airstrip. Then we make it, Rick snapped. We've got 150 people depending on us. But as they approached the airstrip, another obstacle emerged. A sudden storm system had rolled in, shrouding the area in thick clouds and heavy rain. Rick gritted his teeth. Looks like we're doing this the hard way. He lowered the plane into the storm, the turbulence rattling the cabin and sending drinks and bags tumbling. Samantha, following Rick's instructions, worked tirelessly to keep the passengers calm, leading them in brace position drills and relaying updates. The runway lights of the regional airstrip finally came into view, flickering faintly through the rain. But as Rick prepared for the landing gear refused to deploy. Figures, Rick muttered. He glanced at Samantha. Tell everyone to brace. We're coming in for a belly landing. The passengers clung to their seats as the plane approached the runway, skimming just above the ground. At the last moment, Rick tilted the nose up slightly, using the plane's underside to absorb the impact. The plane screeched and skidded along the wet tarmac, sparks flying as it slowed to a halt. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the sound of rain pounding on the fuselage. Then the passengers erupted into cheers and applause. Emergency crews rushed to the scene, helping the passengers disembark. Captain Malone was taken to a hospital, where she was expected to make a full recovery. Rick sat on a stretcher outside, sipping a cup of coffee as he watched the passengers being escorted to safety. Samantha approached him, her face filled with admiration. You saved all of us, she said. Rick waved her off. Just doing my job, even if it hasn't been my job for a while. In the days that followed, Rick was hailed as a hero, though he remained modest about his role. When the airline offered him an honorary position, he declined with a smile. I think I'll stick to being a grandpa, he said. As he boarded a flight back home, this time as a passenger, he found himself looking out the window at the clouds. For the first time in years, he felt the thrill of the skies again.